Plotkin in New York. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on IDAGIO Live. And each Friday at this time, I have a wonderful and inspiring guest. And there are a few more wonderful or more inspiring than my old friend. Sometimes I have people on who I don't know well, but this is a very old friend, Evans Mirageas, who joins us from Cincinnati, Ohio. And he is the artistic director of the Cincinnati Opera, but he's so much more, as you will discover. So, Evans, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. It's always nice to be in your company, even if it has to be virtual.
Virtual. Um, I'm going to say briefly to our listeners about you because you're one of those great behind the scenes figures, much known and loved in opera and radio and classical music and broadcasting. But you are the guy, one of the guys and women who makes these things work and be of super high quality, meaningful, memorable, and also enjoyable, which is not a given. Um, Opera and classical music are not bitter medicine, but they're actually sublime pleasure. You are Greek American. You grew up in Michigan. I want to ask you about Michigan. You have worked at the radio station of the University of Michigan. You worked at WFMT in Chicago. This is another great radio station. I met you when you were working, collaborating with the Brooklyn Philharmonic. You've worked for the Boston Symphony as artistic advisor. You were senior vice president of artist and repertoire at Decca Records, known in the US as London Records. You've worked at the Atlanta Symphony in, you'll tell me the title, and you are the artistic administrator of the Cincinnati Opera. You are a fantastic cook. I can attest to that. And you are a mensch, as we say in Italian. And I am very happy to welcome you. So, Evans, I first want to know, I've changed planes in Michigan, but it's one of the few American states that I've never been to. But when I think of states that have given disproportionately a lot to our nation musically, I would say New York, Louisiana, Tennessee, but also Michigan. Tell me about growing up musically in Michigan.
I grew up in Ann Arbor, which is the home to the University of Michigan. And because even in those days, it wasn't as much of a conservatory as it has become, but the University of Michigan had a spectacular school of music. It also had one of the gems of the presenting world. There used to be a long string of presenting organizations, many of them affiliated with universities all across the United States. Very few of them survive now. But the University of Michigan had and still does have what they call the University Musical Society. And starting in the 1880s, I believe, Ann Arbor was an en route stop between Cleveland and Chicago on the train line. And so all the greats, Caruso gave a recital there in one of his recital tours. All the greats came to Ann Arbor starting in the late 19th century. And because it's a university town, it has a sophisticated population, a music-loving population. And because it's a university town and a state university, well supported, it has some amazing performing spaces, including a spectacular building that was not designed by an acoustician. The only other place of note that he's remembered for is the River Rouge plant of the Ford Motor Company. But the architect who built Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor will go down in history as having created one of the most acoustically near ideal spaces for concert music. It was built as a big lecture hall, seats 3,000 people. And there were smaller places as well. So as a kid, I had access to not only a wonderful public school music education, because in the late 50s and early 60s, there was still really good public school music. And because the School of Music was affiliated with the University of Michigan, our student music teachers were all grad students from the U of M. And because the Musical Society was offering upwards of 150 events a year, this wasn't just orchestras, this was recitals and chamber music and theater and choral groups and all of those wonderful Soviet era, Soviet Union dance troupes that would come through, and so I had a magical childhood and young adulthood because all of that world culture was within an easy bicycle ride of my house. So growing up in Ann Arbor was really spectacular because I was afforded the groundings of a good music education, even in public school, and went to high school there and decided that I would go to the University of Michigan. I enrolled in 1972 in the fall as an undergrad, and in the liberal arts college, by the way. I played clarinet from the time I was in fourth grade until high school, but I realized I could be a good clarinet player, but I'd never be a great one. So I thought, well, I love music. And by the time I was a high schooler, I was crazy about it. I worked part-time in a record store. I had aspirations to be on the radio, whatever that meant. And so my university education was geared as much as possible as a liberal arts student. How much could I learn about music as a liberal arts student? And then other things happened during my college career that made it so much easier and so much more fun to do that. But
what was your
growing up in
major?
Ann Arbor was great.
What was your major in college?
Journalism, actually. Journalism with a minor in art history, actually. But I was really lucky because as a freshman, I started working at the student radio station. And the student radio station had what they called a carrier current, which was an AM station that you could only get through the electrical circuits in the dorms. But they had a small 10-watt FM station. And I got on that FM station with my own classical music radio program, 9 a.m. until noon on Sundays. And then by pure happenstance, the fellow who was the manager of the student station, a wonderful guy by the name of Lee Vanamede, had a new girlfriend. And he had a Saturday night and Sunday afternoon job at the big radio station, WUOM, one of the first FM stations after the war, one of the biggest FM stations in the country. And he wanted to spend more time with his girlfriend. So he said, you know what, I think I'm going to vacate that slot. Why don't you audition for WUOM? So as a cocky freshman at the end of my freshman year, I auditioned for WUOM and I got a job. And it was, you know, basically an engineering job, Saturday nights and play tapes and Sunday afternoons. But it morphed into something a lot more wonderful after that.
I've known you for many years, but I'm still learning things about you. And in fact, things that you and I are very similar at. It doesn't surprise me. But number one is my instrument was the clarinet as well. So was Christine Gerke's, but she went on to become a great, great singer. You and I did not, which is okay.
Only in the shower.
Only in the shower. And I grew up in New York City, so I went to all the theaters here. My parents worked in the music business, but I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. And listeners who don't know America may not have heard of Big Ten universities. These are these large land-grant universities in the Midwestern states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, and so forth. And Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan are sort of the northern tier. Right. And the schools have a lot in common. As I said to you, I've never yet been to Ann Arbor. I've been to the University of Minnesota and most of the Big Ten schools for music. And in Wisconsin, I did not major in journalism because I knew I wanted to do that in graduate school. But I was the arts reporter on the school paper as a freshman because frankly, no one else wanted that. And we had something called the Wisconsin Union Theater, which is very much like the theater you're describing. And basically, the artist who went to Michigan then came to Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. So we had about 3 days later, everything you had. And a lot of the artists who I may have heard in New York City as a kid, I then got to hear again. I remember very specifically, Shirley Verrett just knocked my socks off when she came. And she was then a professor at the University of Michigan after her singing career. But we grew up with the love of opera and music, apparently. Every Saturday, well before climate change, Wisconsin, like Michigan, I'm sure, had a lot of snow. And on every Saturday afternoon, I would stay in my little apartment and cook all afternoon and listen to whatever opera there was from the Met in New York. And I sort of felt like a Chekhov character that was out in the provinces longing for Moscow and St. Petersburg, hearing the sound come through my little tiny radio. But very specifically, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, we occasionally would have Vladimir Horowitz come and perform at 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. And he, the week before, always performed in Ann Arbor.
That's right.
Always. That was a very particular, he was a man of creature of habit and eccentricity. And he would always come first to Michigan. Did you hear him when you were a kid? Or was that
Yes.
the period when he stopped playing?
No, I did hear him. And actually, it was through the courtesy of one of my great mentors, the man who was the chief executive of the University Musical Society, that I got to know Horowitz. Horowitz came for his first recital after his most recent retirement. He hadn't been to Ann Arbor since the early 1950s, before his big silence. So this was the first concert that he was going to give. And if I remember right now, it was the fall of 75. And it was the typical Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. But he agreed to have a press conference on the Friday, I believe. And so it was the papers and the radio stations from Detroit and Toledo and Windsor, Ontario, and me. And I arrived at the guest house where he was staying, and I was met at the door by the formidable Wanda Toscanini Horowitz.
Yes.
And I had an open,
Toscanini.
right. I had an open reel tape recorder, and she looked at me and she looked at the tape recorder and she said, "No, my husband does not like his English." I said, well, Mrs. Horowitz, I'm from a radio station. She said, "No, bring it in, but no recording." So I set the tape recorder on a table, and all of these wonderful journalists were asking about, why do you eat only fish and chicken? Why do you bring only your piano and no one else's piano? Why do you have concerts on Sunday afternoons? I, smart arse little kid that I was, well, little kid, I was just before my 21st birthday. I said, "Mr. Horowitz, I noticed that you're playing a Clementi sonata on Sunday afternoon. How did you fall in love with the music of Muzio Clementi?" "Very good question." So he answered the question. Now, there was no tape recorder running. I was just standing there. So towards the end of the interview, I asked another question. And God love him, the late Gail Rector, at the end of this press conference said, "Mr. Horowitz, you haven't been here since the early 50s. Would you give a statement to the radio?" "So my English is not so good." I said, "Please try." He said, "Okay." So Horowitz and I started walking around this big living room, and I was getting an interview, and I wasn't in front of the tape recorder. So we sat down, and old sly fox that he was, he knew what I was doing. I pressed play and record. And a half hour later, when the tape ran out, he said, "You recorded that?" And I said, "Well, yes, Mr. Horowitz." He said, "Oh, I don't know what you could make of it. I don't speak good English." So I raced back to the radio station, worked like a fiend, and that night at 9 o'clock, I presented a little half an hour or so of excerpts from our interview and some recordings. So Sunday afternoon comes. I come down the aisle towards my seat at Hill Auditorium, and Mrs. Horowitz is walking up the aisle, and she pins me with those two coal black eyes of hers inherited from her father. And she says, "My husband wants to see you at intermission." I thought, oh my God, my life is over. He heard the interview and he hated it. So I went back with fear and trembling backstage. There was Horowitz laid out on the divan, in his wonderful Sunday afternoon frock. And he jumped up from the couch and he gave me a big hug. He said, "My boy, you make me sound like American." And from then on, whenever Horowitz would come to Ann Arbor, he came 3 or 4 more times before I left Ann Arbor, we would go for a walk and talk about everything under the sun. I have one more memory, which is a wicked one from him. He, one season, was going to play the Liszt Mephisto Waltz, the famous one, number 3, I think, if I remember. Liszt, of course, wrote it for orchestra. He made his own transcription for piano. And Hans von Bülow made a famous transcription for piano as well. Horowitz, who was staying in this guest house, had both of the Liszt and the von Bülow on the music rack. And I read music, of course, and he said, "Come, I play you a little bit of Liszt. You tell me what I am playing." Because, of course, what he did is he made a conflation of the Liszt transcription, the von Bülow transcription, and Horowitz. Yes. And so I am there madly reading two sets of music paginated differently and listening for Horowitz when he does his improvisations. He got to the end, I was nearly cataleptic. And he said, "Not bad. I thought you read music." So I have the happiest memories of Vladimir Horowitz.
So do I, actually. It's good that I'm very happy to see you, my friend, but also because there are many things you and I have never discussed, and he happens to be one of them. When I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, I was performance manager, and part of my responsibility then was the well-being of the artists. And Mr. Horowitz arrived with a very long list of requirements, all of which I could tell were carefully plotted out to make it very difficult for the likes of me. For example, he only performed on Sundays at 4 p.m., but wanted to be paid in gold. And I had to check what the dollar gold value was on the Friday at the closing, and then see that the right amount of gold was delivered. That's number one. Number two, you said divan, and that's what triggered my thoughts. He used dressing room S10 at the Met, and there was a divan in there that I had to make up with sheets, and I made it myself to make sure that it was proper. And the sheets had to have a certain thread count, which was very hard to find at Bloomingdale's or elsewhere in New York City. So I had to write to London to get shipped to New York sheets with the proper thread count. And I bought 2 sets just in case one tore. Who knew? The other was that he wanted pillows that were 65% goose down and 35% duck feathers. Now the proportions were always 70-30 or 60-40, but not 65-35. So I had Bloomingdale's manufacture these and make a label for them. And because Horowitz would come maybe once a year, every second year, what did I do with his pillows when he was not there? I kept them in a box in my little tiny New York apartment and would bring them out. I had a special label put on, and I cannot do his voice as you did, but I remember that when he came back, he looked at the label again and he said, "Same ones? The same ones as last time."
We don't make them like that anymore, sadly.
They've been very, very well looked after. Oh, I have no doubt. Did you put your pretty face on it? No, I did not, Maestro. It has been in the closet. But frankly, when he died, then I started sleeping on the Horowitz pillows. And you mentioned about, what did he eat? I never knew him to eat chicken. He had a meal of filet of sole, asparagus, and a baked apple. And there were several events in New York where there would be dinner parties and formal events for people in the music world. And I sometimes was invited to those, not, I think, because of my position and work, but because I could cook. And we had one particular lovely hostess who would make these parties, and she would cook for everyone else and ask me to prepare the Horowitz meal. So I would have a corner of her kitchen, and I would make the sole and the asparagus and the baked apple. And he, instead of dining with the guests, would come in the kitchen and sit with me. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Well, I've always been a pretty good cook." "Good boy. If it doesn't work out for the music, you can always cook food." But
he
anyway,
never lost his childhood wonder. I think it's one of the reasons he remained an interesting artist to the very end, because he was mischievous in the nicest possible way. Yes, eccentric and difficult. I'm sure, he drove a lot of people, including his long-suffering piano technician from Steinway, crazy.
Yeah.
But they just don't come like that anymore. And I feel so fortunate to have been even in the corner of the room, as it were, with him. A couple of memorable evenings at their wonderful house on the Upper East Side, 94th Street, where he would play piano at the drop of a hat, and well into the night. And the thing that impressed me also was his encyclopedic knowledge of opera. One evening, he played nearly the entire second act of Parsifal from memory. That's the kind of wonderful music-obsessed human that he was.
Yeah. One more thing for our listeners. He lived in this townhouse on East 94th Street, and the piano room was a couple of floors up. he would insist that his own piano be brought to the Met or whatever venue, perhaps Michigan, to for him to perform on. And he had two pianos because you never knew which one he felt like playing. So no matter what the weather, people from the Met had to go to the house 8 days before to bring the two pianos to the Met, then have it tuned for him to come in, position the pianos by inches, adjust the lighting, play a little bit, good. And then the pianos would be brought back to East 94th Street from West 64th Street. And then the following weekend, the two pianos would go to the Met again, and he would arrive and tinkle on the piano and decide which one he wanted. His concerts were memorable, but I remember one time at the Met, he didn't like how he played, and he closed the keys and just walked away, did not take applause, and there were no encores at all. So Evans, in general, when you have worked with artists, you've worked with legendary artists of the past and legendary artists of today, and I want to discuss with you the concept of great artists of today. You've seen them at their weak and fragile moments, and I'm not here to gossip, but what I'm saying is, what does it take to motivate an artist who either has fear or insecurity or a bad mood or a bad stomach that day or whatever? How do you make, because you do this, I've seen it, how do you make them comfortable to go out and perform?
I think one of the most important things anybody in my position can do, whether it's a concerto soloist at a symphony or an opera singer or a conductor, is to make them feel that not necessarily that they're loved by the public or even loved by you. This is a business relationship in some ways, but that you have their best interests at heart, and you're there to create as supportive an atmosphere as you possibly can. I don't play the piano, I don't sing, and I certainly don't conduct. But I think I have lived around musicians. I've lived with a singer for nearly 40 years, that you begin to understand the psychology of it. And I think I understand very well why Horowitz got up and closed the lid of the piano and walked off stage, because they are always unhappy with their work. I don't think I've ever met a great artist who comes off stage and is genuinely satisfied. I mean, less disquiet. There's that wonderful Martha Graham letter to Agnes de Mille about, there's just a queer sense of dissatisfaction at your best moments. But I think if there's any secret to it, it is to make an artist feel supported, that if they need to cancel, then they should cancel. If they need an announcement from the stage, they should have an announcement from the stage. But to make certain that you're conveying to them that they have to go out there and do it. It's not, I don't go out and sing Il Trovatore on the stage. So anything in my own, as it were, personal arsenal of good humor and calmness, because I think another thing that's so important around artists is creating a calm atmosphere, a relaxed atmosphere. That doesn't mean a lazy atmosphere or a let's just play atmosphere, because this is serious play, what they do. But to try and create an atmosphere among all the colleagues who interact with that artist to be supportive. And I think it's worked. I mean, there have been present when an artist has to cancel, and that's what you let them do. But most of the time, they just need that reassurance that it's okay to not feel well today, and be human as well as be an artist.
Speak technically about the fact that contractually, artists don't get paid if they don't perform in many contexts, not all.
Sure.
And in the case of opera, depending on the theater and the contract, they have to at least sing the first act. I don't know in Cincinnati what the contract terms are, but at the Met, one has to sing the first act in order to get your check. And I've seen singers struggle through just to collect their check. And I'm not faulting them, because depending on the contract, they may not get paid for rehearsals. They have to pay their manager, their taxes, their child care, their health care, their throat doctor, their psychiatrist, their music teacher. There are a lot of people that they support, so to speak. But are you aware sometimes of when they're really struggling and on the stage or even off the stage? I mean, I'll give you an example. Shall I name her? Yes, I will name her. I tend not to name names, but I will here. Gena Dimitrova, wonderful Bulgarian soprano. Um, I was in a position similar to what you do with the Met, in that it was part of my job to make them feel comfortable for the stage. And she was going through a terrible time because her husband was very ill. And she did not want to discuss that. She did not want it to factor into the way people treated her. So I knew that I could not address the fact that her husband was very ill, but she had come to New York anyway to perform. Singers do this for many reasons. Number one, the check, but also because they love performing, and it gives them a moment of freedom and walking away from their lives. Beverly Sills always said she was happiest on the stage because she had many troubles in her own life. About 2 years later, after her husband died, she came back to the Met. Again, the role was Tosca. And it was a very different Tosca because the one that she did under stress, so to speak, was wonderful, but very methodical. Whereas the one that she did 2 years later, where Mario has been shot, he's dying, non morire così, don't die this way, don't die this way, was so remarkable because it was invested with the experience of her husband. Mm-hmm. Now, audiences don't know, and I don't think they should know necessarily everything going on in a musician's life. What they bring to the stage is what they bring to the stage. I could see the difference with Gena Dimitrova, and it helped me to know that her husband had been ill. And I know that you deal with this all the time, not necessarily that specific story, but these people have lives away from the stage. And artist Kranick, who was my mentor, she was the head of the Lyric Opera Chicago.
My hero.
Always said to me, whether it was the press, whether it was stagehands, unions, representatives, the mayor, funders, donors, but especially singers. And she said this not ironically, you just have to love them. Mm-hmm. And her philosophy really was sprung from love. I mean, I know there's an Irish expression, God love you, which kind of has a bit of Irish irony in it. But in her case, it was you really just have to love them. And I took that as my operating principle in dealing with artists. And it was never fake, because even if there was an artist who, frankly, I really didn't like personally because he or she might have been difficult, I could love them for what they could do. And I see you in action, and I know that you adopt a similar stance, I think.
Well, we have an unfair advantage at Cincinnati Opera that goes way back into our history because, when we started in 1920, we were the only summer opera company. Last night would have been, had we been able to perform, would have been the opening night of our 100th anniversary season. But from what I've read about the company, and it's still true today, we're a summer opera company in a Midwestern city, so Midwestern hospitality. But equally important, in the days, let's say through the 30s through the 60s and into the early 70s, when there were some hotels, but not many hotels in Cincinnati, there were primarily two places that artists stayed. One was called the Alms Hotel, and one was called the Vernon Manor. And artists would come with their families because sometimes they'd be here for 4 and 5 and 6 weeks at a time, depending on what operas they were in. We had a longer season in the earlier days with many more operas. And an artist would appear at the end of June and maybe then again at the beginning of August, and they'd stick around. And there are some wonderful photographs of, Beverly Sills and Martina Arroyo in their swimsuits at the swimming pool because they were singing here the same summer. And so one of the things that the company has cultivated over the decades is a family atmosphere. People are encouraged to bring their families with them. We try and find them accommodation, apartments with kitchens and places where their kids can exercise, or, there are many attractions in the area in normal times. So there's a Kings Island not far away. There's a Coney Island across the river. So
Cincinnati Reds baseball.
Nearly every single summer, one of our opera singers gets to sing the Star Spangled Banner. It's, as a matter of fact, one singer, as part of accepting a re-engagement, said, I need to have it put in my contract that I get to sing a Reds baseball game. We were able to make it happen, but it's not in our control. But I think one of the things that happens here in Cincinnati, in this beautiful music hall that's behind me, in a beautiful lithograph from the 80s, is that we cultivate an atmosphere of trust and support. And so I think it gives singers, everybody likes to sing at home. I think that's why so many opera singers who sing at the Met live in New York, because you can leave your apartment and go to work. Excuse me, I need to take a little sip of water. But when you come here to Cincinnati, you come here and you're immediately in an atmosphere that says, welcome. We start every rehearsal period with a brunch. Actually, we gather the entire cast, the creative team in one of our large rehearsal spaces in Music Hall. And we have a late breakfast and early lunch. You know, like an army, an opera company travels on its stomach. And so if the first thing you remember from your first time working at Cincinnati Opera is good food,
I do.
That's the tone. Mm-hmm.
So while you're drinking, I'm going to give our listeners some background about Cincinnati Opera and American opera in general, because so many people listening are elsewhere in the world than the US. Although opera dates back in the United States to at least 1765 and perhaps earlier, and premiered either in Charleston, South Carolina, or New Orleans. There's a great debate over that, although it seems to have been Charleston. We know that the first great opera town was New York City, where Italians came at the end of the 18th century, including Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's librettist, who brought his books to New York with his wife and became the first Italian professor at what is now Columbia University. And when I was a grad student at Columbia in journalism, my day job was to look after da Ponte's books, and therefore I got to read them all. Wow. And they're now part of the library system at Columbia University, but at that time they were in the Casa Italiana. And opera existed in Philadelphia, all over the United States, Chicago, California, really most of the country. But the oldest permanent opera company is the Metropolitan Opera, that opened on October 22nd, 1883 with Faust. And it was done so often that the Met came to be known as the Faustspiel House. And the Met went out on tour starting in 1883 and for many, many years. And opera came to the country via the Met tours. And they happened to be in San Francisco in 1906 when the earthquake struck. And most of the Met productions were destroyed, and that had impact on the Met. They did not go to Cincinnati. They went to Cleveland. Cincinnati, as you well know, already had a great musical life. It had a wonderful old concert hall that you're going to tell us about. It had a choral festival dating back, I believe, to the 1870s. And so it was not surprising that the second permanent opera company in the United States after the Met was in Cincinnati. And what happened was you had a summer festival in part because when the Met season ended, and then they would have a tour. After the tour, all the great singers, whether they were Europeans or Americans, went to Cincinnati. And so from that point forward, it proved to Americans that we could have opera companies in other places at different times. 1920 Cincinnati, 1923 San Francisco, and on from there. Surprisingly, the Lyric Opera Chicago, only 1954, although opera has been in Chicago forever. LA Opera, 1984. Mm-hmm. So there are older companies, many, but the historic companies really are the Met, Cincinnati, and San Francisco, and then beyond from that. Tell us about Music Hall in Cincinnati.
I will. And you are so right, Fred. Cincinnati was never on that regular circuit that developed, particularly after the Second World War, of Memphis and Minneapolis and Boston. But the Met came to Cincinnati sporadically from that very first tour in the winter of 1884. And on the first stop, I think it was in March of 1884, they did something on the order of 5 operas in 6 days. I mean, it was quite remarkable. And they came back spasmodically, but never regularly. You're absolutely right. But that started to nurture an appetite for fully staged opera. But how opera begins in Cincinnati in earnest is with the May Festival, which predates Music Hall by about 5 years. First May Festival was 1873, organized or conducted by Theodore Thomas. I like to call Theodore Thomas the Johnny Appleseed of classical music in the United States. You look anywhere in our country and he founded something, the New York Philharmonic, the Brooklyn Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the Cincinnati May Festival. 1873 was the first festival, and we have to remember that Theodore Thomas, his career primarily and initially was an opera conductor. He became a symphony conductor later. But in that very first May Festival of 1873, of the 60 items that were done on that festival over its couple of weeks, fully a third of them were opera excerpts. And that tradition continued into the building of Music Hall, which opened for the May Festival in 1878. This wonderful picture behind me, it's sort of the affectionate term in Cincinnati for the sort of mishmash of architectural styles of Music Hall is called Sauerkraut Baroque. It's actually a wonderful creation by a Cincinnati architect by the name of Samuel Hannaford. And so the story goes that the first venue for the May Festival, the first festivals, was basically an outdoor style pavilion with a tin roof. And whenever it would rain, you couldn't hear the singers. So a group of citizens, spearheaded by a guy by the name of Samuel Springer, who was a son of German immigrants. He made his fortune in groceries, by the way, heralding Kroger and Procter & Gamble decades later. But Springer spearheaded the building of Music Hall. And in a little more than a year between inception and opening its doors for the first May Festival in 1878, Music Hall was built. It was built as a public-private partnership. So everything from nickels collected from kids at school for instead of their milk money to 4- and 5-figure gifts. Springer provided half of the original money to build the hall, and the public provided the other half. And it has been a home to music ever since. But when Music Hall opened in 1878, it was a concert hall that sat nearly 5,000 people. It had one balcony, no stage house, no orchestra pit, and an enormous Hook and Hastings pipe organ at the back of the stage. But by the 1890s, the people who were in charge of running the hall, the corporation that was in charge of running the hall, said, look, we're losing our shirts. We can't present staged performances. There was opera in Music Hall as early as 1881. There was a touring company that did a production of Lohengrin, but they had to build a sort of a false proscenium, and the orchestra sat on the floor. That wasn't going to last for very long. So in the 1890s, the building closed for a major renovation of about 2 years and reopened pretty much as it is today, with a capacious pit, a fly space for flying scenery, a reduction of the seating to a modest 3,400 seats, 2 balconies, and enough gilt and red velvet and white plaster to, populate 3 Italian opera houses. And this grand lady of Elm Street has been the home for classical music, the center of classical music in Cincinnati ever since. But as you know, Fred, it wasn't our first home. We started in 1920 at the Cincinnati Zoo.
Yes, tell us about that.
Well, without belaboring the point, what happens by about 1915 or so, there's a big appetite for opera in Cincinnati. The Met is now coming regularly. As a matter of fact, in 1911, we think Toscanini conducted a performance of Otello with Leo Slezak on the stage of Music Hall. But 1916 is an important year. A young, enterprising conductor who studied with Arthur Nikisch by the name of Ralph Lyford comes to work at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. He has a real appetite for opera. And no sooner does he arrive than he and conservatory students are putting on opera excerpts around town. And lo and behold, 2 great ladies who also saved the Cincinnati Zoo a decade or so earlier were really beginning to be worried that the Cincinnati Symphony didn't have enough work because the season was short, it started late in the fall, ended after May Festival, and then all of the players had to disperse. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they could work in the summer? Already there had been some opera done at the zoo, excerpts, Ralph Lyford conducting students from the conservatory. And so Anna Sinton Taft and Mary Emery got together and said, we need an opera company. They couldn't do it in music hall. Remember, this is before air conditioning. It would have been like giving opera in a sauna in the summertime. It gets hot here in Cincinnati in the Ohio River Valley, and humid too. So the zoo, because it was at a higher elevation, was thought to have a slightly more salubrious temperature. Really wasn't. But the zoo had an advantage. First of all, it was already a home for music. Members of the Cincinnati Symphony played concerts there all the time on the bandstand, and it was a band shell. But very, very quickly, in time for the opening of a 1920 summer, June 27th, 1920, a somewhat makeshift performing space was created. Never had a pit. It was, the orchestra was on the floor behind a fence. Didn't have much backstage facility ever. I mean, it got better as the years went on. But it opened on June 27th, 1920, with a performance of all things of Martha by Friedrich von Flotow. And it exceeded everybody's expectations in terms of the popularity. I mean, thousands of people came for that first performance, and they only had 400 seats. So very, very quickly, starting in the summer of 1921, lots of improvements were made. A real pavilion was built to shelter people from the elements. The stage was expanded. But as anyone who was at the zoo all the way up to our last season there in 1971 will tell you, it was a bit of an adventure. When it would rain, if it would rain hard enough, just like Santa Fe, the rain would come in sideways. One performer says that he started out the evening weighing 230 pounds, and he got back to his hotel after a particularly steamy night in Cincinnati, and he weighed 210. Now, what a great weight loss program, right? But the zoo was amazing because, as you say, Fred, particularly starting in the 1930s, as National Socialism began to take over Germany, and then the war darkened the clouds and made it first unsafe for Jewish performers, and then unsafe for anybody. Performers had no place to go. No Salzburg Festival, none of the early European festivals. So all of the great artists, if they wanted to work, came to Cincinnati. So we very, very quickly became Metropolitan Opera West, San Francisco East, Chicago East, and even in the earliest days, the Metropolitan Opera Chorus formed the nucleus of our chorus. So our connection with the Met is very, very strong and very, very historic, but it is in typical Midwestern fashion, totally unique in that I don't think the Met would ever perform at a zoo, but we did. And we certainly
yes, we did too. But that's for another time. I want to jump in with a couple of things because I do want to take you then off to London. Cincinnati is a very particular place, and I like it. You know, I've visited even before you were there.
Welcome guest.
I would go because I love going there. I'm a huge baseball lover, and the first team was the Cincinnati Reds. And I learned a lot about the city. One is, of course, as you mentioned, the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. It really helped to have one of the best music schools in America in that place. It gave a foundation the way you in Ann Arbor grew up with music. People in Cincinnati grew up with music. It's a town with a very large German-American population that also was very devoted to culture and music and so on. And it also has always had a significant African-American population. Today in America is called Juneteenth, it's June 19th, and it is increasingly becoming an important holiday, as it should, celebrating the fact that ultimately African-Americans were given, I don't want to say given, they earned their freedom, but still so many strides had to be made and still have to be made. Cincinnati, being on the Ohio River, was a point of arrival from Kentucky and further south. And when I have been to the market, and I forget the name of the market found in 1852. Yes, it's a wonderful market. And I've met African-Americans there who have stalls, and they trace their history back to 1852 and to coming across the Ohio River, in effect, going from the south to the north. Cincinnati Opera did an opera called Margaret Garner, based, I believe, on a book by Toni Morrison, who was from Ohio. And therefore, she knew whereof she spoke. Cincinnati has always had a significant Jewish population. And one branch of American Judaism was actually founded in Cincinnati. And Jews kind of like classical music and opera. James Levine is from Cincinnati. Kathleen Battle is from nearby Cincinnati. So I know that many of our viewers may not have a particular association with the city, but I want them to understand that it's a very special spot for the cultural and historic reasons, but also the fact, as you've so ably described, its very long devotion to opera and classical music in ways that few American cities have had. New York, Chicago, later on, Philadelphia, of course, Boston, Baltimore, Cincinnati. And then other cities came later, but those really were the core. And Cincinnati goes way back with that. About 100 years ago, it was the sixth largest city in America. So that now it's a so-called middle-sized city, but at that time it was number 6. So it historically is important, and right now is important. And with that, because you and I could talk for hours, I know, but I'm watching our clock. I want to take you off to Decca and London. And how did you wind up being hired to be the vice president of artist and repertoire at Decca Records in London?
I owe it to my Chicago days, actually, because in the 1980s, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra had as its music director Sir George Solti. And Sir George recorded exclusively for Decca throughout his career. He made a couple of records for other companies, but on loan from Decca. And Decca's head of A&R at that time, who'd been the head of artist and repertoire since the 60s, after the legendary John Culshaw left to work for the BBC, was a man by the name of Ray Minshall. And I got to know Ray. I would go to the recording sessions of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the Medina Temple. And also, of course, in those days, before the rift with artist Kranick, Luciano Pavarotti came to Chicago nearly every season. And I remember, having a meal with Ray as he was off to have an interview, as it were, with Luciano about recording projects. So I got to know Ray a little bit early on. And then as part of my time working in Chicago, I created a program within a series that we did called Lincoln's Music in America. But there was a mini series within it about the history of recording from the end of the Second World War until the beginning of the digital age. And of course, one of the companies I profiled was the Decca Record Company. So I went to London as part of the research for this, and I interviewed Ray Minshall, and legendary characters, sadly, all of who since passed away. The wonderful producer, Eric Smith, the equally wonderful producer, Christopher Rayburn. He's the man who discovered Cecilia Bartoli, by the way. I loved the company. I loved the sound. I loved the operatic history of it. So when I was working for the Boston Symphony, I remember in the summer of 1993, I got a phone call from a headhunter who said, I'm doing a search for a rather important international record company for their head of A&R, and I'm wondering if you'd be interested. And I said, is it Decca? And he said, well, I'm not at liberty to say that. And I said, well, then I'm not interested in talking to you. I know it's Decca because Ray Minshall's a friend of mine. And why are you asking me? I'm an American. Aren't there Europeans out there? And he said, well, we've sort of exhausted it. Would you be interested? And I said, no. And I wasn't playing hard to get. I had a wonderful life. I worked for the Boston Symphony, which had Tanglewood. My partner and now husband was working for the Boston Lyric Opera as their artistic administrator. Life was pretty peachy, but they were persistent. And finally, I remember on a rather wintry day in December, Ray Minshall and I met at the then very, very drab foyer of the Royal Festival Hall in London, because I'd gone to Europe with the Boston Symphony on tour. And I said to the headhunter, all right, I'll talk to Ray one more time, but he has to be very honest about what he sees are the challenges going ahead. I left that meeting with Ray on the banks of the Thames that dreary morning, thinking I would be an idiot not to try. And Ray left the meeting thinking he'll never take the job. So I started at Decca in February of 1994. Ray retired 1 month later. It was an absolutely magical time in my life. It was a very difficult time because we had to reduce the number of artists and the size of our budget. The CD heyday was over by 1994. And the whole idea of an international record company that created a stable of artists and nurtured them throughout their careers was fast disappearing. But I accepted the challenge because I thought there would be a way to do it with grace and to reduce the roster and reduce the budget and really focus on just a few artists. I mean, when I came to the Decca record company, there were 2 string quartets and 10 pianists and 5 orchestras and Lord knows how many people under contract. And through attrition and yes, through some very uncomfortable conversations, we got it down to, I think, a more reasonable size. But then history kept marching on and the company kept shrinking and it was bought and sold twice while I was working for it. But when I left at the end of 1999, I was really proud of what I had been able to do to help downsize the company in a strategic way and leave them still with a core of artists. I'm very happy, which to say, I think just about all of the people that I either signed or re-signed are, if they're still among us, are still making records with the company. Maybe only one every couple of years, but they're still there. Starting with Renee Fleming, of course.
So many directions to go on this. I'll just tell you briefly, you mentioned Christopher Rayburn. I had one job, one freelance job for Decca. It was in June of 1988. And I was hired. They never told me what my job was, but I figured it out. We were in Bologna in Italy, and I studied at the Conservatory of the University of Bologna. And it's my favorite Italian city. One eats incredibly well there. And I, by then, had worked many, many times with both Kyrie Decano and Jose Carreras, who were invited to do a Manon Lescaut. Originally, it was to be Luciano Pavarotti, who also was a friend, but then Jose came in, and he and I went back even further than I did with Luciano. And I think my job was just to make sure that Kyrie and Jose were happy. And they were well fed, and I was very well connected in Bologna. I knew doctors, I knew chefs, I knew everyone. And my job, I don't know what you would call it. It was not a shepherd. It was not a helper, but just to make everything run smoothly, not in terms of producing the opera.
But Fred, you miss out on something very important because you were an A&R man, because one of the jokes in the record business in those days was it's not artists and repertoire, it's artists and restaurants, because musicians love to eat.
It's true. And it was a wonderful experience. They recorded in a deconsecrated church because the acoustics were good. And Christopher Rayburn was a magnificent person and character and very reassuring, but got everything done that he had to do. And artists, not Kyrie, but artists can be nervous, and they need to feel relaxed. And what you were talking about much earlier with what you do on the stage was in effect what I was doing with them in Bologna. And we got a couple of apartments, and I would cook in one of them so that if they didn't feel like going to a restaurant, if they didn't want to strain their voice, I would shop and cook. And I don't know where that goes on the resume. But Evan, before we get to Renee Fleming and Georg Solti, you and I met actually through food. Would you like to tell a brief version of that story?
I was working a freelance contract for the Brooklyn Philharmonic in the early 2000s after leaving Decca. And my wonderful chief executive, Catherine Cahill, who is now the chief executive of the Mann Center in Philadelphia, said, we're thinking of trying to collaborate with, maybe it was the Met, I can't remember, Met Museum, and there was, or one of the Italian cultural centers, and there was to have been an exhibition of Italian work, either Michelangelo or Da Vinci, I'm forgetting that now, but it's being curated by this fellow by the name of Fred Plotkin. And I'd love you to meet him to see if there's a way that we could collaborate with him. Now, I said, wait a minute. I don't know anything about a Fred Plotkin having to do with art and music, but I know that Fred Plotkin is the author of my favorite cookbook called The Complete Pasta Book, from which I cook many, many recipes all the time. One in particular, sort of an Italian version of 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. I said, it's got to be the same guy. So I went to the restaurant. I think it was Vice Versa on 51st Street where we met for the first time. And I had in my bag, not books about opera or Michelangelo. I had my cookbook, all tattered and torn, covered in tomato sauce and, you know, bits of whenever I tried to cook with it. And I said, are you the same Fred Plotkin? Because there was no picture on the book. very modest. And he said, well, I happen to be the same. We were fast friends right there. He autographed the book, and our friendship was begun through the medium of food and has continued through music, of course.
Just, the title the publisher gave it, and I adored my editor and still do, was The Authentic Pasta Book. And I never liked the word authentic. My title when the book was proposed was Pasta Diva, which to me makes perfect sense, which leads us back to Renee Fleming.
Too funny.
She was a young artist when you first worked with her.
Well, she came into my orbit in the summer of 1991 when I was working for the Boston Symphony, and we were doing a concert version of Idomeneo, a semi-stage version of Idomeneo at Tanglewood. And rather late in the process, we lost the singer who was going to sing Ilya. And her manager happened to have Renee Fleming on his roster. And he said, would you take her as a substitute? And I said, well, we're sort of out of time. And I asked my boss, Seiji Ozawa, we had a cassette tape of her singing. And he said, okay. So Renee Fleming came and sang a brilliant Ilya for us in Tanglewood. I came back in touch with her a couple of years later when she was in the first cast of The Ghost of Versailles at the Met. And and then when I first started working for Decca, one of the very first recording projects I did with Sir Georg was going to be a live recording of Così fan tutte. Sir Georg was revisiting some of the operas from his earlier days and reconnecting in particular with Mozart, for which he had a new appreciation. He'd actually studied some of the early performance practices, and although he was working with a modern orchestra, really wanted to get some of the style, and he wanted to record them live. And maybe less than a month or so before the recording in the spring of 1994, I'd only started a couple of months earlier, we lost the singer who was going to sing Fiordiligi. And I got a phone call one day from Sir Georg, and he says, my dear, do you know this Fleming? Her manager says she's perfect for Fiordiligi. And I said, well, Sir Georg, I do know her. I've seen her, I've hired her once, I've seen her work. She's a wonderful Mozart singer. And she just was going to be opening the new Glyndebourne Opera House very soon in Mozart. I said, I think she's worth the risk. So on the night of the first performance that was recorded live, she received a thunderous ovation. And I rushed backstage and I met her manager, the wonderful American Tom Graham. And I said to Tom, does she have a record contract? And he looked at me in his wonderful way and he said, not yet. And we immediately began to work to sign her to be an exclusive artist for the Decca Record Company. And some of my very happiest Decca memories are associated with Renee and the many recordings we made together.
Well, I do want to mention that readers know that I ask my guest each week to supply some preferred recordings that are on IDAGIO for them to go to. And you gave us 3, one of them being what's called the Blue Album by Leontyne Price, which to me, it sounds so naughty that, she's singing something a little that she shouldn't be singing, but she's singing Verdi and Puccini magnificently well. Then the Così fan tutte that you worked on, conducted by Georg Solti, with Renee Fleming, Anne-Sophie Van Otter, and a wonderful cast, Frank Lopardo, Michele Pertuzzi, and then Gregory Spears' opera Fellow Travelers that I'm going to ask you about in a moment. But Georg Solti, hero of mine. I met him only a couple of times, so I can't claim I never worked with him. What was it like to work with Georg Solti?
I was intimidated at first, of course, but I grew to regard him as not as a father figure per se, but as someone whom I treasured very, very deeply. Here was a man who had, at least at the very beginning of his career, a really bright future that was interrupted by the Nazis, and he fled to Switzerland and got a very late start as a conductor. And he was very fortunate after the Second World War to be taken up by the American Armed Forces, who were looking for conductors who were free of the taint of Nazism, and Solti, being Hungarian and Jewish and a refugee, fit the bill. And everyone who reads about music knows his incredible life story of a wonderful career in music. But I met him after he had crested his 80th birthday. And he had been with Decca all of his career since the 1940s. And there wasn't much yet new to record for him. And so he was revisiting some of the things that he wanted to do earlier and trying, as it were, get right. He was a relentless perfectionist. And people have this impression of George Solti, I think, from the podium. You know, someone uncharitably called him the Screaming Skull because he was a very aggressive conductor physically and whatnot. But what people didn't know, I think, was that Sir George was an incredibly generous man. Most people don't know that, you know, lots of musicians who were on hard times could always appeal to Solti, and he would give them a gift of money that would help tide them over. He was so important to so many young careers. And I just adored working with him. I think my favorite memory of all, though, was occasioned by a rather hilarious circumstance. After Karajan died, the Berlin Philharmonic was really stuck because they didn't have their star conductor anymore. And Karajan, who had pretty much blocked Solti from Salzburg and from Berlin, was gone, of course. And the Berliners wanted to continue to make records. And the most prominent conductor then alive was Sir George. So they patched it up, and Sir George started making records with them. But the Berliners thought that Solti that Karajan was still alive. And let me put it this way, that their financial demands were unrealistic. We made one record with them. And then Sir George wanted to make a record of his three teachers. He wanted to honor his three teachers in anticipation of his 85th birthday, Leo Weiner, Zoltán Kodály, and Béla Bartók. And we put together a beautiful program that we were going to try and do with the Berlin Philharmonic. And I couldn't get to a price that was reasonable. So I called Sir George and I said, Sir George, we're just going to have to rethink this. And he said, oh, to hell with Berlin. Let's go to Budapest. So I called up Ivan Fischer, who was the head of the Budapest Festival Orchestra, who was making recordings for our sister company, Philips. I couldn't finish the sentence asking him. And he says, of course, I'd love to put my orchestra at the disposal of Sir George. Nothing would make me more proud. And ironically, it turned out to be Sir George's last recording. We did it in the spring of 1997, in anticipation of his 85th birthday. And during that trip, we were being followed around by a BBC television crew. Solti had agreed to go to the Budapest Opera, where he started, and tell the story of how he got his start in the theater for the BBC crew. And I wound up going early with him because he had also agreed to hear some of the young singers of the Budapest Opera. And he put his arm around mine, and we stood at the edge of the pit where he had first conducted opera without a rehearsal on the night of the Anschluss, and told me the entire story of that amazing time, which is in his wonderful book. I think it probably was the most magical half hour of my professional life. It was just the two of us in the theater, and he was telling a new friend, as it were, his amazing life story in the most humble terms, that he still couldn't believe all those years later that this gifted little Jewish kid from Buda and Pest had made it to the top of his profession, and in some ways against all odds.
I don't think I ever told you that the month that he died was September of 97. And I was living and working in Italy that year on the Italian Riviera near Genoa in a little town. I was writing a book, and I had opera jobs in various Italian cities. And he had an institute down the road in northern Tuscany where he taught in the summers. And as it happened, I can tell you the date, August 27th of 1997, in my little town in Liguria, a yacht parked, and the couple on the yacht came in, and they were Dodi El-Fayed and Diana, Princess Diana. And I had lunch with them in a little trattoria. That's for another time to tell. And 4 days later, they died. And Liguria, which is the flower growing capital of Italy, all the flowers had been cut and sent to London to be placed at
Mm.
memorials for Diana.
Mm.
Just a few days after that, not even a week, Mother Teresa died. And so the world was focused on Diana and Mother Teresa. A couple of days after Mother Teresa died, George Solti died.
That's right.
And no one noticed. And with no disrespect to Diana and Mother Teresa, but George Solti died. And I don't know if you remember that time, it went
Very
apart
well.
from the likes of us. No one noticed that this magnificent musician who with a legendary career had died. Where were you when he died?
I was in our home in London, actually. And it was on the day, I think, of Princess Diana's funeral, actually, that Solti died. And I remember Tom, my partner, now husband, was, I think, on the second level of the house, and he had the radio on. I known that Sir George had been unwell. He'd had a heart attack earlier in the week, and he was rallying. He was, their home, their summer Italian home was in a little town called Roccamare, and he was in a nearby hospital. But he suffered a second heart attack and passed away that day. It was such an empty and sad feeling for me, because here was someone who was really reaping the rewards of a long, long career. I think what made me particularly sad is that we had assembled a wonderful cast for a recording of Tristan, because Sir George was never happy with the Tristan he made in the early 1960s with Birgit Nilsson and Herman Uda. It's not that he didn't like the singing, but the recording was at a time when Decca was doing a lot of experimenting, and he just was never satisfied. And I asked him about a year before, as your 85th birthday present, Sir George, what would you like to record? And he said, Tristan. And I gulped, of course, because that's 18 sessions with the Vienna Philharmonic. No other orchestra will do, of course, and world-class singers. But we were a company that had made a tremendous amount of money with Sir George over the decades. And so my chief executive said, let's do it. So I am trying to recall the cast exactly, but I think it was Deborah Voigt and Ben Heppner. Remember, this is 1997. So Deborah Voigt, Ben Heppner, Matthias Görner as Kurvanal, Anne-Sophie von Otter as Brangena, and the young René Pape as King Mark. Yeah. And of course, it never happened, sadly. The one consolation from that recording not happening was a very happy ending for Renee Fleming and Christoph Eschenbach, because I felt so honor bound to the Vienna Philharmonic that had carved out so much time in 3 different periods to make this mammoth project with Solti. So Renee, of course, as we know, is a wonderful singer of the music of Strauss. And I proposed to her and to the VPO that we make a recording of scenes from Strauss operas. And so we did, with Christoph Eschenbach, one of her all-time favorite conductors, of course, a man who was very important at the beginning of her career. And so we have that incredible record of the final trio from Rosenkavalier, the final scene from Capriccio, including the Mondnacht interlude for the great principal horn player of the Vienna Philharmonic. And also a little gift. Sometimes karma works. But Barbara Bonney was one of the singers for that recording, and participated, of course, in the trio and the duet from Arabella. And she said to me, she had the same agent, by the way, Tom Graham. She said, Evans, if there's time, could we record the presentation of the Rose? And I said, well, it's a Renee Fleming record. I can't give you a solo. She said, I understand, but I was supposed to be on a really famous recording of Rosenkavalier a few years ago, and I got kicked off because the local company that was going to be really important for the sale of that record said, unless you put singer X in that recording, we're not going to release it. So she was out. Now, she had made a DVD, let's remember, of her incredible Sophie with none other than Carlos Kleiber. But she felt sore that she'd never had the chance to record audio presentation of the Rose. So we did. Renee was very gracious. Christoph was very gracious. And we did just a couple of takes. And that little excerpt of the presentation of the Rose has appeared on several compilation recordings of Barbara Bonney's. But I still miss Sir George, I have to say. To be in the company of such a protean musician who had worked with Toscanini, whose own score of Otello was annotated with things that Toscanini did. was a tremendous privilege. And also to get to know Lady Solti, because Valerie, Lady Solti, is one of the classiest people you will ever have the good fortune to meet.
She
And
is indeed her. Yes.
and I am so glad that, two of his pet projects, the World Orchestra for Peace, which continues today, run by Charles Kay, his longtime amanuensis, and the Solti Foundation, which awards gifts and opportunities to young conductors, carry on his legacy. And of course, we still have his recordings.
So there are so many things I want to ask you, and I'm mindful of time, but there's one more thing I have to ask you about him. I wrote an article many years ago called The Left Hand of God, because many conductors, they give the beat, they hold the baton in the right hand. It's the left hand where, to me, the expression, the details come out. And to me, the greatest left hand of a conductor that I've ever witnessed, and I saw him a lot, was Georg Solti. The only one who comes close is Valery Gergiev. But really, Solti, can you tell me anything about his left hand? Did you watch it? Did you notice it?
Do you know, I think some of it is actually much more than just the left hand. I think one of the things that any teacher of conducting will tell you is that any idiot can be taught how to conduct. 4 is not difficult. 2 is even easier, and even 3, and I can't conduct. But the magic occurs in the ability of that conductor to convey those things that just telling players where they are is secondary. It is this combination of the eyes and the body language. And yes, to an extent, the left hand. But Solti had an unusual technique. I mean, as I said, he was caricatured by some of his by musicians because he had sort of a way of beating that looked like a bird trying to take off, and yet
or lay an egg.
Yeah, and yet he was able to communicate. So I think the alchemy of it's not just the left hand; it is the whole combination of this incredible ability to see everything that's going on and to make eye contact with players in a way that gives them reassurance, puts them on the alert, reminds them of what they were doing in rehearsal. One of my dearest friends is conductor Robert Spano. And Robert says, at the concert, yes, I am trying to provide a slightly higher level of inspiration than we were at rehearsal. But my real job at the concert is to remind people of what we've done in rehearsal and give them just a little bit more energy so that the concert is a step above it. And I think that was one of Solti's great gifts. He was an incredible rehearser, very exacting, very meticulous, as any good conductor needs to be.
There are YouTube videos of him rehearsing that I commend to our readers. I want to move on to an opera that you were very involved in its genesis, Fellow Travelers by Gregory Spears, with libretto by Greg Pierce. I saw it in Cincinnati. Full disclosure, I gave the pre-performance talk about it. It was done in repertory with Fidelio, which I think was not by accident that you did that. Tell us about this opera, which is really, it's a wonderful opera. I've seen it many times.
Fellow Travelers is one of the fruits of our wonderful collaboration with the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. It's called Opera Fusion New Works, generously funded by the Mellon Foundation. I'm co-artistic director of this enterprise with my wonderful colleague, Robin Guarino, who teaches opera at CCM.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Opera Fusion New Works was designed to offer opera companies and individual composers and creative teams the chance to workshop an opera before it goes to the stage. Quite often, they were operas that were already slated for the stage. Our very first one, Doubt, by Doug Cuomo, was already set to be premiered at Minnesota Opera. And many of them in the last almost 10 years now have been operas that have been ready to go with a company. The Met, to mention another one, and several others. But every once in a while, we would take on an opera that didn't have a home. It was the composer wanting to see, the creative team wanting to see if the piece had legs. And Fellow Travelers was just that opera. We were approached by the creative team with a wonderful pedigree because Greg had already had some success. But the real driver for us was Kevin Newberry, the director, with whom we had worked as early as 2007 and who was really making a name for himself already. And the man who was the producer, he had seen the value of this story very early on, a great guy by the name of Sterling Zinsmeier, who read the book by Thomas Mallon called Fellow Travelers about the Lavender Scare of the 1950s And
Would you define
so,
that for people who are not in America? What was the Lavender Scare?
yes. So we all know of, I think, even our international friends know of that dark time in the early 1950s when Senator Joseph McCarthy was trying to ferret out communists in our government. What was going on equally powerfully, and actually more women and men lost their jobs over being supposedly gay than being communists, was that there was an equal, particularly as related to the State Department, an equal witch hunt to root out homosexuals from government employment. With a kind of fervor and a kind of nastiness and a kind of blackmail that was almost worse than being called a communist. So upwards of 5,000 women and men lost their jobs. Many more people lost their jobs and took their lives than any one of the communists supposedly run out of the government. Thomas Mallon wrote a wonderful fictional book called Fellow Travelers, which is based on some of the stories of that time, but it's fiction. And Gregory Pearce, the wonderful playwright, and Greg Spears, composer, and Kevin Newberry worked together to create the opera Fellow Travelers, which tells the mythical but based on true story of a rising young star in the State Department by the name of Hawkins Fuller, early 30s, very polished, very handsome, but also a closet homosexual. He, like so many gay men of his time, there were meeting places, there were a couple of underground bars, there was the DuPont Circle Park, there were places of meeting that gay people knew to meet each other. And along comes an innocent new graduate from Fordham University who majored in journalism to Washington, D.C. to come and work in Washington and help root out communism, good Catholic boy by the name of Timothy Laughlin. And they meet in DuPont Circle. And Timothy's eyes are open and his life is totally changed as he falls in love with Hawkins Fuller. And the drama revolves around their growing love affair, the terrible need to keep it secret, the subterfuge that goes on around them, then the stunning betrayal that is at the heart of this opera. And we workshopped it, and I remember sitting in the final...
One more thing. There's also a woman, a soprano character who's very important.
Miss Lightfoot.
Yes.
She's the bad guy. Well, there's two actually women that are very important. There's Mary, who is first Hawkins Fuller's friend and then befriends Timothy or Timmy.
That's
Skippy.
the one I meant, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Mary is a very sympathetic role, and she's the woman who knows Hawkins well and knows his secret and knows that he's a heartbreaker and knows also that he's incredibly ambitious and selfish. And then there's Miss Lightfoot, who is the tattletale and who basically unravels the story or their secret. But we have, at the end of all of these opera fusion workshops, we have a presentation for donors and some invited guests of scenes from this opera. And I remember sitting in the front row with Patty Beggs, now our General Director Emeritus, just retiring at the end of the summer, and both of us weeping at the end of this and looking at each other, and we said, we have to do it. We just have to do this piece. So we put it in motion. We paid for another workshop apart from Opera Fusion, brought the team together, sets designed by Vida Tsikun, directed again by Kevin Newberry, conducted by Mark Gibson, who was the head of orchestral studies at the University College Conservatory of Music, and an incredible cast with Joseph Latanzi as Hawkins Fuller and Aaron Blake as Timothy Laughlin. The opera was premiered in the summer.
And a soprano, I didn't know Devin Guthrie, who really knocked
phenomenal.
My socks off. The three of those, I wanted to ask you before you go further. I didn't know any of those three singers, and I know singers. How did you find them? And they just were perfect, all three?
Joe was a student at CCM, and he was in the workshop, and he was Hawkins Fuller. He's a tall, good-looking guy who has this incredible acting ability to be both at once sympathetic and dastardly. That's why he's going to be a great Don Giovanni. He's already a great Count and Figaro. Aaron is someone I knew because Aaron had auditioned for me a couple of years before to sing Don Ottavio in Don Giovanni. And Devin, I did not know. And Devin is someone that was brought to us by the creative team and by my wonderful colleague who now works for an opera company in Austria, Marcus Kuschle, who was our director of artistic operations at the time. And the cast was put together with a combination of people we knew from CCM, a couple of people who'd been in the workshop, and some people that had been recommended to us by Kevin and by Greg. And it all came together rather magically, I think. The opera is now about to have its 10th production, and it was only premiered in 2016. It's a runaway hit, and it has a commercial recording of which I am very proud.
On Adagio. I hope listeners go to that. And my friend, you and I could talk for hours, I know, but I want to conclude with one of our patron saints, Saint Leontyne of Price of Laurel, Mississippi. You picked an album that I believe she did originally in 1961, although I think it was reissued in the 70s. And why, not that I need to ask, but why this album, Leontyne Price, the Blue Album?
I've admired and adored the artistry of Leontyne Price since I first started listening to opera. And that album, as an LP, for the old folks in this crowd, was one of the first albums I bought as a budding opera lover. I worked part-time in a record store after school, actually, and my very first mentor was my first boss, a wonderful man by the name of Gerd Mauerhoff, who ran the Liberty Music Shop in Ann Arbor, Michigan. No relation to the famous one in New York. And he was a big Leontyne Price fan. And I actually wasn't a soprano fancier at first. I loved tenors first. Sopranos came later. And Callas first, of course, because I'm Greek, and then Leontyne Price. And I bought that album, and I wore out a copy, actually. I had to buy a second copy of the album because I just wore the grooves through. It was nearly perfect singing, as perfect as any human being can possibly register. There wasn't a phrase that was out of place. There wasn't a characterization that wasn't true to who I imagined the character to be. And I had not seen any of these operas live on stage at that point. And I got to see her a couple of times in recital, later in her career, of course. And I never got to see her sing staged opera. Tom and I watched that famous final Aida in a small color television set in our little apartment in Chicago. But I did see her sing in recital in Ann Arbor at the University Musical Society, and at a concert with the Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra and Semyon Bishkov, another old friend of mine, conducting. And it was, for those who have never had the chance to hear this voice live, it was even more spectacular live than it is on recordings. But I think one of the reasons I treasure this recording more than just the singing that it is that RCA Victor took a chance. Now, RCA Victor had made records with Marian Anderson. They had employed an African-American singer as an artist on their label. But RCA Victor made a commitment to Leontyne Price that was probably record-breaking, because she made her first record in 1959, a song recital of Fauré and Poulenc and Strauss. Then this record that was made in the summer of 1960. And both of these, of course, as you know so well, Fred, predate her debut at the Metropolitan Opera. She made a complete recording of Trovatore in that same summer of 1960 with Arturo Basile and Richard Tucker conducting.
And her debut was January 1961 in Trovatore with Franco Corelli.
Yeah, his debut, right, as well. What a night to have been at the Met. Yeah. But I admired the A&R head of RCA Victor then. I think it was probably already Richard Moore. It might have been, I think it had to be Richard Moore at that time, for making a commitment to Leontyne Price. And RCA, she made some records elsewhere, but RCA was her record label for all of her career, like Decca was Solti's record label. So I love this record, and I love the records of Leontyne Price in part because of the commitment that the company made to promote the career of an African-American artist with the same kind of fervor and intensity and dollars behind it, because operas aren't cheap, that they had for Van Cliburn, or that they had for Arthur Rubinstein, or that they had for the Guarneri Quartet or Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra when they came back in the late 60s. So that's the reason I love this album.
Well, just in your comment about her, you triggered so many memories of mine. It sounds like your connection and relationship with Solti was like mine with Leontyne Price. Oh, I had the great honor, that was her word, but I'm going to use it because I felt the honor to be the honored person to work with her a lot. When you saw that last Aida, I was in the wings, right there in the tomb scene and the Nile scene and so on. And I'm the guy who took her back to her dressing room after all the curtain calls. And no better colleague in the world, magnificent. I have nothing but marvelous things to say about her. She is still, thank God, with us.
Very
Uh,
much so.
the Met, for those of you watching live, today is June 19th. Juneteenth, as I mentioned, the Met is doing a series online, metopera.org, of special events regarding African American singers. They're doing Leontyne Forza, which I worked on, and they're also including an interview with her that was done on near her 90th birthday, and it's really not to miss. Evans, thank you, my friend. Thank you not just for being a wonderful friend, but when I posted on Facebook that I was going to have you as my guest, I got more feedback than I got for any of my previous guests about how excited people were, and all the colleagues and singers and people who love the art form and Cincinnatians who wrote in and said to me that they were very glad that my audience, who may know a lot of the singers and conductors I've had more than they know you, would get to know you. And this has been great. Anything you need to add?
I'd just like to say to any young woman or man who is watching this, who may aspire to a career as a opera producer or working for an orchestra, or to enter this arena that I have been so lucky to work in for, well, I've gotten a check for working in music for 50 years, basically. Sometimes a very small check, but I've made a living. Is that I think the things you need more than anything else are a dogged devotion to never stop learning. There's always another score to study, another book to read, another adventure to have, and also to make certain that you're humble, because you have both a privilege and a responsibility of helping great artists achieve their best. I am at my happiest when I hear the roar of applause for an artist that I've engaged, that who I might have given a first opportunity to, or equally important, maybe have given an opportunity to after a rocky point in their career, and they're back on top. Not because of me, but because I had the opportunity to give them an opportunity. And the components I think that are essential for success in this area of behind the scenes work in our profession are a thirst for knowledge, a willingness to work hard, and a sense of humility. Because I didn't write La Boheme, and I can't sing like Leontyne Price, and I can't conduct like Sir George Solti. But what I can do is recognize that these are treasurable human beings that need support, that need intelligence, that need help in managing that thicket that is that borderline between their personal life and their professional life. And if you can do that with a sense of grace and a sense of humility, you will succeed.
Thank you. I want to just tell our listeners that next week I have an unusual guest, who unusual just because he's not like everybody who's come before him, the very brilliant, talented travel writer, Rick Steves.
Oh, wow. I would love to meet Rick Steves.
Everyone says I would love to meet Rick Steves. And maybe outside of America, you don't know Rick Steves, but you really don't want to miss him. He's very special. And I know his musical side, and that's going to come out a bit next week. But in the meantime, Evans Mirageas, thank you, my friend. Thank you, listeners. And I will see you all next week. And be well.